For weeks now, there have been ongoing protests and unrest in the city of Portland, Oregon. Law enforcement from the federal government and the Department of Homeland Security have been deployed in that area and has caused a lot of concern and questions about their use of force, as well as their ability to quell the unrest in the city. So today on the Tonic podcast, we're going to dive into what's going on in Portland, how difficult it is to get a real answer with the state of current news, and what this means in the larger scale of federal regulation and federal authority. So let's just dive into it. So what we have going on is Portland is still having ongoing protests. Started with the death of the murder of George Floyd. It has now morphed into a more kind of just anti-police use of force, anti-authority, a lot of calling for larger scale reforms to policing as far as community policing, training, and then we talked a little bit in a previous episode about defunding the police and what that means. So we're kind of in the middle or later game stages of these protests, right? It's not necessarily tied to one incident now. It's kind of a larger scale idea. And in response, Trump has deployed the Department of Homeland Security along with a few other departments, including Border Patrol, different agencies part of the Border Patrol. He's even said the Coast Guard at times. So it's kind of this hodgepodge mix of federal authorities that we first saw in Washington, D.C. Probably about a month ago. And then now we see them in Portland. And it's caused a lot of concern. And the main concern is that these officers have police on their camouflage, but they don't have their names. And at times, it's hard to identify which department they're coming from. So I think the concern is, there's two concerns. One is how do we, stop the unrest, right? One side is saying this has gone on long enough and the city of Portland needs to get back to normalcy. And on the other hand, people are saying, we're protesting against unconstitutional use of force, and now we're seeing unnamed, masked federal authorities with no department to hold accountable for take people into vans, and there have been reports that some people have been Mirandized and some people haven't. So it's causing a lot of concern for different reasons on both sides. So I just want to get, Alex, your kind of initial thoughts. What do you see going on in Portland, and do you see it? Do you see it continuing or ending anytime soon, or just kind of opening thoughts?
So first off, I'm not going to say anything absolute yet, because I think over time we're going to really see maybe the true rationale for a lot of this. But my first take is it is disturbing. And I want to go out first and say I am not someone who thinks, oh, this is Trump's Gestapo. This is us going into full-thrown fascism here. No, because most of these people have been released. Yeah. You don't hear about the Gestapo doing that too often. And also, this isn't really as much of a secret police like they are. I mean, people do know they're there, and that's not me, condoning what they're doing, but I'm not going to go that far yet. But I think this is something that we've been seeing for a few months now, is that Trump is kind of playing with what he has, and he's trying to figure out what he can get away with and what he can't. Yeah. I remember Susan Collins told us back after the impeachment that, Trump's learned his lesson. He'll be better now. Well, the contrary's happened. I think gassing people outside the White House when he did that Bible photo shoot was kind of his practice rehearsal for this. He's starting to realize what he can do. And this is kind of that slow transition into authoritarianism. And I'm not going to just, blow the whistle and say that, Trump's the next dictator. But there's a lot of things that really worry me here. And I don't like his messaging about liberal-run cities, because to me it seems very similar to Pinochet after the fall of Allende in Chile in the early 70s, when it wasn't as much of a Holocaust-like division where it was, looking to get rid of a group like the Jews or maybe the Armenians during the Armenian genocide. This was more of socialists. You kind of demonize the other side, right? And it's really good for your base. And that's what's worrying to me, is that this could be the beginning of some serious strife in the country, because I think a lot of people are scared. A lot of people don't know what's going on, and I think Trump's message of bringing law and order could work in some of these places, but it also could hurt it. So that's my initial takeaway is this Operation Legend, as he calls it. I mean, he wants to send the troops to Chicago, Albuquerque, Kansas City. He wants to do about 200 federal agents drawn from all across the Justice Department. I mean, and the worst part is these cities they're not asking for it. Like, the state and local officials are not asking for it.
Right. Yeah, I do think that, that rhetoric really matters when he says, liberal cities, like liberal run cities, have given up and are allowing the rioters to destroy, their foundations. And that's super charged and politically charged. You know what I mean? I do think that, and we'll get into it, that there is some precedence for sending in federal troops in some of these instances. But I think we have to look at the devil is in the details. And some of it is the accountability issue. I think that they need to be greatly, like, I do think that the officer's name they need to be on their badge. I need to know who's doing this. There needs to be accountability. Because like you said, most of these people have been released, right? I saw a video of a guy getting, shoved into a van by camouflaged police, but he was released 9 hours later. He was Mirandized. And he was released, right? So you're right that it's not full-blown Gestapo. But what happens if that guy isn't Mirandized and we don't see him after 9 hours? Like who do we call to be like, hey, I don't think that was constitutional. There has to be accountability. Now, the response is that, well, we're not putting our officers' names on their badges because of doxing. Okay, I see how that is an argument, but I also think, like if you're a federal officer in charge of law enforcement, isn't that kind of comes with the job? Like, we don't hide detectives' names, we don't hide judges' names. I think that yes, okay, there is probably an issue with people doxing and bullying people on social media, but that is the cost of a transparent justice system. So I do think that even if that is the case, that you're worried about your officers getting doxxed and people being like, hey, that officer is an asshole, that is the cost of what it takes to have a transparent justice in our society. So I don't buy that argument to the full extent. I do think transparency is key. So my issue is that, these troops and these federal authorities have to be easily identified so that there's accountability. So that way they can, hey, we're the ones that did it, and hey, here's our reasons for why it is constitutional. And then people go, okay, here's our reasons for why it's not. We have to have that debate, but we can't have that debate if we don't even know who's doing the arrests of the protesters. I also think, we have to look at what is kind of the main issue that we have in Portland right now. Is I think there is a complete breakdown of trust between the citizens and local law enforcement, right? I think that the goal now should be, how do we rebuild trust in communities and law enforcement? How do we, part of that is, right, things we've talked about before, right? Community policing, all these more longer term goals of like training, community policing, blah, 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 right? Which we've covered in other things. But first is we have to, not have unrest and have a general understanding that law enforcement and the citizenry want to promote a better society. And we don't have that right now. And I think that by adding in masked, unnamed federal troops, it makes it harder to do that. It breaks down that trust even more, especially in a place like Portland, where it's, I would argue, more left, more radical than the average American city, and probably has less trust in local law enforcement than your average American city. Even the Portland police chief himself said, the addition of federal troops has made this more complicated. In quote, it complicates things. It complicates things is a very politically, diplomat way for that police chief to basically be like, it's not making it any easier. It's effing things up. Because, I do think that we do need to rebuild trust in local law enforcement and the citizens, and having these federal authorities go out there and do the, putting people into vans that are not marked police. I've seen the videos. You can look them up. It's camouflage guys putting protesters into just unmarked vans. That is very scary. And whether or not, now, yeah, they are released after, but it's still scary that that's even happening in the first place. And so the problem is what's called the Streisand effect, right? Whereas in the attempt to quell something from happening, you accidentally inflame that action more, right? Barbra Streisand tried to hide from the paparazzi in her Malibu home, so put up giant walls. All that did was basically tell everyone, hey, that giant mansion with the huge walls in Malibu is where Barbra Streisand lives, and the paparazzi bothered her more. This is what I think is going to happen, especially with Portland, which is so politically active and leftist and outspoken of a city. This is not going to quell the protests. This is going to make them last longer. This is going to escalate things. It might lead to more violence. I don't see this situation getting better when you have unmasked federal authorities trying to quell the protests in a city that didn't ask for it, like you mentioned, that did not ask for it.
Well, now, Drew, but let me hold you there. I think that's all part of it. I think that's all part of the chaos here.
Sure.
I don't think Trump wants to help this. I think he knows exactly what he's doing, and it actually in the long term could work for him. Because let's just go over how this has transpired a little bit. And first, what I would say is that it kind of looks like Trump is trying to egg on a culture war. It looks like he wants to create a culture war, because while Democrats like Joe Biden and even some conservatives like my boy Rand Paul are actually trying to talk about logistics, Trump is more worried about the culture war, the supposed culture. And so the protests were starting to quell. Protests were starting to die down. And then I think it was last month, he was preparing to do an executive order that would protect federal monuments. So that's kind of step one, right? He says we're protecting our history from left-wing extremists. And don't get me wrong, I think there's some crazy people on the left. I'm not saying that there's no crazy people on either side here, but I think he then kind of decided to use Portland as an example. It's like, okay, Portland has a history of protest. It has a lot of kind of anarchist kind of leaning energy.
Yes.
And I think he wanted to make an example out of Portland. So he has decided to egg on a culture war. There was no ask, but he sent the troops there. And I think for a lot of his base, it's going to get him even more popular. But it's also worrying because his base doesn't really need him to do anything else. And for people like me who are, I'm voting for Biden, I believe, but, I could be convinced if there was really something good to vote for. But for me, I just see someone who wants to sow chaos. But I think a lot of people, I think this law and order message could work in the long run because, if you're just watching these protests, you see, okay, every monument from Columbus to Frederick Douglass getting torn down, and some of these should be torn down and others shouldn't, but you're kind of seeing just this eraser being taken to a lot of our history. And also you're seeing police are unable to respond to some situations. Paramedics are being stopped by protesters like, Chaz or Chop, which you talked about a few weeks ago. So I think this is an opportune time for Trump to do this, and I don't think it's right, but I think for a lot of people, maybe 50%, I'd say 45% of people, maybe they're like, you know what, maybe he's doing the right thing. And right now polls are not showing that, but I'd like to look at those same polls maybe in a month or month and a half if this continues. But I do agree with you that if he's trying to unite the nation, this is not the way to do it.
Yeah, he's certainly not trying to unite the nation. He's never displayed the rhetoric of uniting the nation once, I don't think.
I don't think so.
And even if there was, if someone has an example, I bet you it's half-assed. Because again, it's the Democrat-run cities. The Democrats want to destroy America. That's almost verbatim. If you watch his Mount Rushmore speech, he says the radical left liberals and the Democrats want to take away everything that you stand for. It's pretty it's obvious that he's not trying to unite people. He's trying to inflame one side. You're right that maybe that's the whole problem is he's not even trying to quell the protests. He's trying to inflame the culture war. And the problem is news sources like Fox News or on the other end, MSNBC and websites like Salon, they're doing the opposite. On one hand, you have all these protesters are freedom fighters, and let's just ignore the rioting. Let's ignore the fact that paramedics had problems getting to people that led to deaths. But then on the other hand, you have Fox News saying, these are radical left liberals that want to destroy America and erase history. I don't think that's necessarily true for the majority of people involved in these movements. And we're eliminating any nuance, and it becomes this culture war. It becomes this. Well, which side do I agree with? Do I agree with this side? Then that means I'm for federal troops to come in and do things. Or am I agree with this side? Then that means I'm against federal troops. And we're forgetting something I think is pretty important, which is the Constitution, right? Which is not involved in the culture war. And so let's look at what our Constitution and the judicial branch, which determines the constitutionality of things, has said. So I want to quote here Supreme Court Justice William Rehnquist, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan and was generally considered a conservative Supreme Court judge, but he had a couple swings. Here are his quotes. "We can think of no better example of the police power, which the founders denied the national government and reposed in the states, than the suppression of violent crime and vindication of its victims." Right? So to put that simply, those who are involved in handling crime, then suppressing violent crime, and then enacting out those justice, constitutionally, it is the states. And it is then they've gone as far to say denied the national government that right. In fact, there are very few things that are considered federal crimes, and almost completely it is up to states to go against, local crime, violent crime, right? So in this instance, then, it is up to the states and local authorities to handle this. And so it is interesting to me to see conservatives and, I guess more, not necessarily ideological conservatives, but political Republicans are so gung-ho about this, federal authority going in to quell these protests. And it's like, what happened to, states' rights and limited federal government? On the other hand, too, it is also ironic to see, liberals that are very pro-federal authority now be so worried about it now that it's being used against them. So it's kind of switched everyone on their head. Okay, if that's the case, people are so politically entrenched in their teams that they've almost switched their entire views on federal authority. That's depressing on its own. But so let's look at some of the precedents for when this kind of action is used, or at least similar kind of action, which I'll get into. So looking back at use of 12 times the president called in the military domestically. I'm looking at the Chicago Tribune. A lot of them have to do with the civil rights. So you have the desegregation of the Little Rock School. And this is the famous case of the first African-American girls that were admitted. And this is in 1957, right? This is a result of Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled the segregation of schools to be unconstitutional. So it took years for schools to integrate and desegregate, and only because of the use of the National Guard was there to enforce it. If you look here, the integration of the University of Alabama, where Governor George Wallace famously blocked the entrance and used his own authority and power to deny it until JFK federalized Alabama's National Guard. Again, more integration of Alabama schools. 1963, that's almost 10 years after Brown v. Board, that they were still doing these things. And only then, after national troops were involved, did they desegregate some of these schools. The Selma March, right? The late John Lewis, where he was beaten by local police. Only a week or two later, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. then led the marchers across Selma. And this protest, strangely, kind of contrary to what we're seeing today, this protest was actually protected by the Alabama National Guard. Right? They were protected by the National Guard from the local authorities on a 5-day march. And then here's where kind of things shift, right? Where, we're seeing these kind of pro-civil rights movements, and then now we have rioting, right? So an all-white police force arrested black revelers, leading to riots, the Chicago riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., right? So we've seen riots lead to the enactment of National Guard before in regards to civil rights unrest. So we've seen this before, but I don't think this is, these are state National Guard that are members of that state's community that, as far as I know, could be easily identified in their uniforms and had that accountability of this is the Michigan State Guard or sorry, the Illinois State Guard. This is the Maryland's, National Guard, and you could then have a track of accountability for the people enacting these actions. I think the big difference we're seeing today is that accountability is lost when it's a morass of bureaucracies that it's hard to identify, and it's just a no-name masked person shoving you into a van. I don't think that's what happened when these National Guards were deployed to the riots. They were there to, yes, limit the violence, try and quell unrest, limit looting, but they were not there shoving people into vans to go off to who knows where.
Right. And I would also say that, at least from a lot of these cases, even going into the LA riots, I think, 92 or something like that?
Yep.
It seemed that usually federal employees of some form were called in to help these problems when either A, the state asked for it,
yes,
which we've already talked about, or B, there was a violation of human rights inside of the state, or someone's rights are being infringed on. So there was an outcall for this form of help. And I think that's the big difference we're seeing here, is that it does kind of seem like a shadow response by a president who is down in the polls. And I think that is kind of the worrying thing about it. And yeah, I mean, like what we're looking at here from the Chicago Tribune is, I mean, it's a point well taken, is that usually there's, I guess if I was to sum up what I'm seeing there, is that usually there's a reason or a justification for this that isn't political. And I think that's where you could in some ways kind of divide Trump's current response from a lot of these, is that Trump's is purely political. He's down in the polls, and he is clearly trying to send a message that he is the president of law and order, and that he wants to stand for some of our statutes and American values. And honestly, like I tell my friends and my parents or relatives whenever I'm talking with them that I do fear that some of this Antifa movement and some of these fractions of the Black Lives Matter protests movement are going too far. And there are parts of me that fear that we don't need to be erasing everything. Trump is really sparking a match that could be thrown into just a pile of gasoline that is really alarming to me. And it goes again back to kind of my 1970s Chile thing, that I think when you only demonize the other side and put them into one category, it's very easy then to start sending the police to lock them up because they're a threat to the nation. And I mean, and back to what you said earlier, there's a great quote from Michael Dorff, who's a professor of constitutional law at Cornell. And he says in quotes, "The idea that there's a threat to a federal courthouse and the federal authorities are going to swoop in and do whatever they want to do without any cooperation and coordination with state and local authorities is extraordinary outside the context of a civil war."
Yeah.
And I mean, like, let's just throw it out there. I mean, that's unfortunately the vibe I get, is a cold civil war going right now. And I guess you could call the culture war that. That's what it's slowly becoming. And it does really worry me, because we're going to have a constitutional crisis come out of this. Market Watch has a great piece on that. And they even had an interview that they sat down with Rand Paul, and even he is worried. He says we cannot give up liberty for security. Local law enforcement can and should be handling these situations in our cities, but there is no place for federal troops. And I mean, Rand Paul might be one of the only Republicans left who's actually saying, hey, like this isn't normal, especially as a conservative. You should not be wanting the federal government coming in and doing this, especially when states and localities have a lot of resources. And
yeah,
but now I do have to say, just to go to the other side a little bit here, is that you did have Portland's mayor, and you have mayors like de Blasio, who I think is horrid, just completely condoning kind of rioting and looting. And it only feeds, I think, this narrative that Trump is pushing and Fox News are pushing, that you're not safe. These cities are lawless. And people like de Blasio especially are not helping it. He said he's glad that his daughter is out with the rioters and looters. And, he's told the police to step down on numerous occasions. And I don't think that's the solution either. So it seems like we've got to this point where these sides are egging each other on. And even if a culture war is only symbolic, it's slowly getting there.
Well, look, I mean, I'm unsure that they suggested people should be looting. I think people should. I think they made statements like, "I understand the unrest people feel." I highly doubt any. I mean, if you do have a quote, I'd love for you to bring it up. But
De Blasio has asked the police to stand down in parts of New York, and he was applauding his daughter for being alongside looters and rioters.
okay, well, look, I mean, that's irresponsible as a mayor for sure. But that doesn't then allow the unconstitutional act of federal employees, right? Like, you know, one thing could be bad, right? Like a mayor, not being responsible enough to quell looting and allowing protest, but then not going against looting. But then that still doesn't allow us to then use unconstitutional use of federal authority in a culture war, right? And I know you agree with me there. I do think that I think there's just a couple aspects that boil down to is one, the Constitution, right? Even conservative Supreme Court judges are being like, this needs to be handled by state and local authorities. And two, the effectiveness, right? Back to my original point was, did some of these police ask for it, or the mayors ask for it, or is it just muddying the situation? In Portland, at least, which is the most, talked about and on the headlines example of this, the Portland police chief said it's not helping. It's basically not helping. It's actually making things more complicated for them. And so if the goal is to actually get to an effective solution, and then you find out it's not, then you need to stop that. You need to stop that idea. But I think you're right that it's not about having an effective solution. It's about appealing to his base, appealing to that law and order base. And because his polls are slipping, maybe he thinks that, where I can win back some polls and maybe some moderates is this law and order thing. So I'm going to paint the protesters as thugs, as anarchists, as violent. Some of them are. I would say that the vast majority are not. But you use the minority to then spoil the majority. And then you paint them as radical leftists taking away your America, and so I'm going to save you by bringing in national troops. It's a dangerous road. I mean, it really is a slippery slope. I know that's a rhetorical strategy, but this is where that slippery slope really comes into play. Is, hey guys, we can't just be throwing federal troops at anyone you disagree with, because one day it might be turned around on you, and you're going to be the Rand Paul being like, this is a I don't know, man. It's a shame. I really do think, I understand that there is precedence for using National Guard, but it should have been the Oregon National Guard. It should have been the Oregon National Guard. It should not have been the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. No, I mean, I totally agree with you. And, I was just criticizing the response of Portland's mayor and
sure.
Blasio in New York. And mainly just because I don't think that they are helping. I'm not saying that the federal response is good, but I also do think that we have to realize that a lot of average working people in these cities do feel like things are not safe.
Sure.
And I think that's more my point, is that Trump has capitalized on this. And right now he's still losing to Biden by significant numbers. I was seeing 9-10 earlier in the polls I was looking at. But I'm curious in the long term, if these protests continue, I don't know. And the other sad part of this is that violent crime is actually up. In cities like Detroit, which I'm looking at the numbers for now out of USA Today and the Detroit Free Press, they say that all crime is down by 11%, but violent crime has been up by 7%.
From when to when, though? From when to when?
Well, yeah. So they're looking at 2020, but more specifically June and July.
Okay.
And already it's up 7% from May into June, and then it's already even up another 7% from June into July. Like, there were 36 violent murders in June in Detroit, and there's already 28, and we're not even through July yet. And so all I'm saying is that we are seeing, unfortunately, that between the protests and Trump's lackluster response and his lackluster messaging, I think that police feel paralyzed in a lot of cities, but also there's not really any great solution. And they interviewed they interviewed Chief Craig of Detroit's police department, and he stressed that they actually need federal agent help in some of these cities. And that's the problem is that Trump's doing it for political reasons. But there's actually serious problems in some of these cities that need to be addressed. And we're beating around the bush and just, Trump's made this political, but there are cities that are asking for help. And I remember in Seattle, there were similar messaging being sent out because people are just not able to get, law enforcement and medics and fire departments cannot respond. And I do fear that this breakdown in some cities, even if it's created by Trump, could still be strategic messaging. But the one thing I'll just finish and I'll let you go is that luckily for Democrats and people that do not want to see Trump reelected, you're not a historically popular president. Promoting to be the president of law and order when you've kind of led to the civil unrest is not a very sound policy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh, I do want to say, look, again, talking about the precedents, right? Which department said they needed help? You said it was...
They were talking about Detroit specifically.
Okay.
But they also put out stats for Atlanta, Chicago, and I believe it was Albuquerque. No, sorry. It was Miami as well. But Detroit was the one where they actually sat down with the police chief, and he stressed that federal agents could actually be needed because some of the protests have turned violent, and there's a lack of actual resources because specifically their police department is underfunded and undermanned.
Okay, so if that's the case, right? If that's the case, then there needs to be. It should be the Michigan National Guard. Right. And there needs to be accountability. So, okay, if we really are, wow, like this is getting out of hand, we need some help. Let's bring in the National Guard. We've done it before in the past with, we've seen, right? We need to make sure that they are accountable, that they're not escalating the situation, that they're not targeting journalists. Like there's a way to do this. Like there is a way that, okay, yes, if a police department does feel that they're undergunned and can't control the situation and bring back law and order, yeah, I understand that happens. There has to be a means to do that is constitutional, accountable, and transparent. And so that would be appropriate. What I'm not seeing, that's not what I'm seeing in Portland.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I agree with that. I just think that unfortunately there is a problem in these cities where there is a breakdown. And I do feel like a lot of police departments feel like, well, A, there's a spotlight on them, which justifiably so, but it does infringe on their ability sometimes to do their job. And I think B, with these just, with just the way things are going, there are police departments in cities that need help. But like you said, I'm with you. I think these are a state issue, and we should not be sending DHS agents, Border Patrol, ICE. Like all that to me just has a more clandestine purpose.
Yeah.
I don't like it. But no, I agree with you. I agree with you. But like we always talk about, I think this issue is just multifaceted. And
absolutely.
It's very difficult. And I do think that for a while, I mean, there's a reason. Like I live in a rural part of California. It's a second home spot for a lot of people that live in big cities. And there's a reason why with the pandemic and with these protests, a lot of people are leaving the cities if they can work from home in the countryside. People don't feel safe in the cities.
Yeah. Hopefully we will return to some normalcy soon regarding, the global state of the world. And yeah, I really do hope that some of these parts of the cities can start to rebuild the trust between people and law enforcement and rebuild the accountability between citizens and law enforcement. Because, I don't want to see more people get hurt. I don't want to see more people get, be the victims of police brutality. I don't want to see businesses become the victims of looting. I do hope that we can start to see that we have more in common in this world than not. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our media and our leaders are trying to make us forget that. But with that, that'll be this episode of the Tonic Accord podcast. 2 heavy hitters today. Not exactly the funnest topics. Some heavy hitters. But it's always interesting stuff that need to be talked about. Hopefully next time maybe we can throw one in there and it's a little more lighthearted, a little more fun. Because man, today was rough, but necessary. So again, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Tonic Accord. What are your thoughts on the deployment of various national bureaucracies and troops to these cities? Is it needed? Is it a step too far? What are your thoughts on the kind of the precedent set by past times we've seen this, and maybe the differences between then and today? Any of these thoughts we'd love to hear. Again, that we are now starting live streaming and video content. So if you catch us on YouTube, you'll be able to see some of the articles we post up and some of the videos we watch live. You'll be able to see our ugly mugs as well. So follow us on YouTube, on Twitch, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and keep a lookout for new content. Thank you all for listening.